You are not going to believe how many crazy stories about UFO encounters and spotting orbs and unusual glowing objects, including floating laser beams and all sorts of strange stuff, have happened up and around Skinwalker Ranch way before the stories that you've probably already heard of. We're going to go deep into the history back into the 1960s, and if you've missed part 1 and 2, this is actually part 3 of this whole series where we're investigating the untold secrets and history of Skinwalker Ranch and beyond.
You ready?
There is a connection between the paranormal, UFOs, and the myths of ancient history. The clues are scattered across the landscape from a forbidden past, maybe even in your own backyard. There is a connection between the true nature of our reality, consciousness, and the unexplained. I'm Carl the Crusher. Let's explore the unknown. If you missed part 1, we dug into the origins of the name and the ancient indigenous history of the area of the Uinta Basin. A big part of my recent video series and documentaries are focused on Mount Wilson Ranch, which is actually the predecessor to Skinwalker Ranch that a lot of people have never heard of. Bob Bigelow and the entire Skinwalker Ranch team, including some of the psychic spies out of the Stanford Research Institute that invented remote viewing, were up at Mount Wilson at the same time as they supposedly got the phone call and heard about this place in Utah that had all sorts of UFOs. Now, that story at Mount Wilson Ranch supposedly happened in the 1990s, and Jacques Vallée is the one who said that he got the phone call and heard about this mysterious location up in Utah that was full of UFOs. Bob Bigelow decided to buy Skinwalker Ranch in 1996 in the fall, and he was at Mount Wilson Ranch before that with his team, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what they were doing there. But technically we can't get to Mount Wilson Ranch yet, and we can't get to 1996 in the first Deseret News article called Frequent Flyers that talks about the UFOs. But for some reason, in 1995, 1996, Jacques Vallée and Bob Bigelow and everyone up at Mount Wilson Ranch are claiming in Forbidden Science Volume 4, Jacques Vallée's journal, that they heard about this place up in the Uinta Basin, this farm that was owned by the Sherman family that seemed to have loads of UFO activity happening on it. But what's interesting is if you've ever read this book, it's called The Utah UFO Display by Frank Salisbury. And a lot of this has to do with stories from a guy named Joseph Jr. Hicks. And this talks about how Frank Salisbury from the Uinta Basin up and around Skinwalker Ranch was good friends with Jacques Vallée clear back in the early 1960s. So that's where we're going to go first. We're going to go back to the 1960s, to the early days when J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée, and Frank Salisbury are actually in California together as part of a group that they called the Playboy Panel. And they were going around talking about UFOs and all sorts of incidents that they thought may have been valid. They would get up at these different conventions and also debate each other and propose their different opinions, and then all go back to different houses that they all hung out with and were friends. So we have Frank Salisbury meeting Junior Hicks up at a convention in Salt Lake City, and Junior Hicks informs him that there is dozens of UFO incidents happening up in Utah and around this whole area. There was no nickname Skinwalker Ranch mentioned at all back in this era. So before we get into all these fascinating UFO stories that I'm going to show you, we have to keep in mind that Jacques Vallée was friends with Frank Salisbury back in 1976, and they were going around speaking at different conventions together. And a lot of these UFO stories actually happened even 10 years before that, leading up to this. So I find it interesting that Jacques Vallée and other researchers are sitting up at Mount Wilson Ranch at 1995, and in Forbidden Science Volume 4, Jacques Vallée acts like they've never heard about any UFO activity up around Utah at all. So I wonder where this book came from 30 years earlier, if everyone feels like they never heard about this place having any UFO activity. It seems like they actually did know. And so we're going to get into all of those. And when we get into these UFO stories, I want you guys to pay attention to the similarities between one and the other. If there's any kinds of themes, certain colors that seem to be specific with the incidents, how they start, how they end, where they happened, and all of that, because you're going to notice that there's some interesting patterns. We're going to go over 10, maybe a bonus one, of the best UFO stories coming right out of this book. And I even collaborated with artificial intelligence in order to create graphics to help showcase exactly how these events went down. So buckle up, guys. We're going to go back in history to 1960 to Joseph Jr. Hicks as a school teacher having his very first UFO encounter that kicked all of this off. In fact, I would wager to say if Junior Hicks didn't have this UFO sighting and then start going around the community, stirring up interest, we may not have a Skinwalker Ranch at all. The very first recorded UFO sighting ever in the media was actually Kenneth Arnold in 1947. He was a firefighting equipment salesman out of Boise, Idaho, who was actually flying his airplane over Mount Rainier when he spotted these strange V-shaped, almost boomerang-shaped aircraft flying through the sky. He described them flying and then going down like into the mountain or over the mountain and disappearing. And then later, when he talked about the way that they flew through the sky, the newspaper said and quoted him that they were like flying saucers, even though the way that they moved through the air is why he described how they moved through the air, just like a dish skipping across the water or a saucer. And so it's very interesting. That's the initial actual UFO story. And they weren't flying discs. They were like boomerangs. And that was in 1947. So Kenneth Arnold had his UFO sighting in June 1947. And then in July of the same year, 1 month later, or just a couple weeks later, you have the Roswell crash. The Roswell crash was covered all over the media. And then that kicked off a whole wave of people spotting UFOs and all sorts of strange stuff in the sky. Once that Roswell story and incident broke after Kenneth Arnold, within a couple of weeks, the UFOs were a hot topic. But then you have Joseph Jr. Hicks, and he is actually a school teacher up in the Uinta Basin in Utah, and he's out on the playground with his classroom of school kids when they actually look up in the sky and see something unusual that he says that he's never seen before. Now, we have no way of knowing if Junior Hicks actually was into UFOs before this sighting, but the very first incident that we get out of the Uinta Basin with all of this is Junior Hicks going outside on the playground with these school kids, and they all looked up and claimed that they saw this floating craft or orb-like object up above the schoolhouse. They all watched it for a little while, and then the thing basically flew away and disappeared. And that kicked off Junior Hicks's entire obsession and fascination. And at this time, Junior started going around actually hosting public meetings where he would invite UFO witnesses and people who have had different encounters into these meetings in order to share their experiences. And he started cataloging all of these incidents and then breaking down the similarities between one and the other. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend that you get it and go check it out. But we're going to get into the first incident right now. One of the first people that Junior Hicks interviewed was a man named Dean Powell. Mr. Powell was delivering mail to a small post office in a town called Hanna when he looked across the road from the back of his mail truck and saw something really unusual. At 10:15 in the morning, he was leaning against his truck waiting for the postmistress, Miss Crystal Hackett, when he noticed a silver craft hovering in front nearby the hill across the river. It was perfectly silent, and he called Mrs. Hackett, and she came out and saw the object, but then immediately ran to get her children so that they could see it. When they turned around, the object had moved slowly to the north. What's unusual about this one is that the shape of it. It's kind of like the way that he drew it. It's like an acorn with the bottom squished out. So like a flying saucer, but pinched a little bit on the top. It reminded me a lot in the drawings of the ship in the Flight of the Navigator movie. So in our first incident, we already have a strange silver object from a postal worker with more than one witness. He went in and got the mistress, and she had some children with her, and the whole group saw this craft, and they confirmed the drawings that Mr. Powell had done. And that's just one of 10 stories we're going to go over today, and number 2 gets even weirder. On August 9th, 1965 at about midnight, Kent Denver was driving in the desert with his fiancée and her little brother. and they were coming around a turn when they saw something really strange in the sky. And the way that he describes it was like a floating bowling pin. It looked like a bowling pin, but a big one, and it was hovering up in the air, but with windows all around the top. As their headlights swing towards it, the bowling pin thing lifts up into the air, and they actually see a flame coming out of the bottom, like a red flame. Denver, in his witness account, said that this bowling pin object seemed to hover, and then when it would lift higher into the air, that's when they would see this glowing red flame seem to come out of the bottom. So a lot of people at the time dismissed this one as seeing some kind of a rocket takeoff or a rocket booster test, but it's still strange that this thing is shaped like a bowling pin floating in the air. It kind of reminds me of the rubber duck UFO footage that came out of the Border Patrol last year. Number 3 is the Massey Batty sighting. This one is really strange. You've got a couple of ladies who are working in their kitchen. They're actually juicing tomatoes. She just went to go talk to her husband after he went to bed when she notices that there's a red light out the window to the west. She decides to leave the kitchen and go towards this utility room to try and get a better view, and that's when she noticed this thing is like a giant oval, and it's floating outside low right above the trees. And as she gets a closer look, she also sees it's not just a glowing red oval, but there's a red laser beam actually coming out horizontally from this oval. So then she goes outside to try and get a closer look, and then it gets even weirder. This light is moving really slow just above the treetops about a mile away in front of these low foothills, and then suddenly it occurs to her she's looking at a giant machine. And this thing is as big as a house, and there's this horizontal red laser beam coming out of the sides. As she gets a closer look, she describes it like this big oval that has different colors. It goes from yellow to green to blue, and then there's this red laser emanating out horizontally from the object. She describes this machine floating down, not making any sound, and actually resting on the ground. A few of her friends actually come over and they sit and watch this thing sitting on the hill for like an hour together. They just sit and watch this UFO that they describe like a machine emitting these lights and this laser beam while it's sitting on the hilltop. So they decide they're going to get in the car and they're going to go drive towards it. But when they do, this thing lifts up in the air, changes into multiple colors, and then flies away and disappears. But then 3 days later, the thing comes back. And this time, it just goes yellow and green and blue, and it sat in the same spot. The same people came over and they all observed it, and they actually stopped watching it and went to bed. They didn't even report that it actually flew away or left this time. In fact, they said they got so much detail looking at it the second time that they could have sworn they actually saw the shadows of figures or entities moving inside of windows inside the object. Blows my mind. I'm really intrigued by this red laser beam it seems to be emitting out, because that's going to become an important theme. Throughout the autumn of 1966, there is a huge wave of these sightings of this red laser beam. Sometimes the laser beam shoots completely across the valley, sometimes down from the sky into the ground. Sometimes it's almost like a pill-shaped object, like a glowing plasma thing, a moving laser that is like a certain length that floats across the valley just above the bushes. But there is dozens and dozens, maybe up over 60 different reports and accounts of this red laser moving around, scanning people from all different walks of life. This happened all throughout the autumn of 1966. Our next witness account of an actual physical craft comes from a young Native American boy named James Couch. On September 15th, 1966, James is out in his backyard when he witnesses what he describes as a 50-foot double convex dome. This is almost like a classic flying saucer, almost like a blimp-shaped object, and he sees it hovering, almost gently touching the ground in a clearing of the woods behind his house, and it's only about 5 feet off the ground. Now, it's only about 100 yards away from the back of his house where he's standing, so James is actually brave. He goes up towards this object. The thing starts spinning around really fast and then shoots up in the sky. And then this pattern of objects showing up in backyards and above people's houses, it just doesn't seem to stop. Priscilla Screech and a few of her friends were actually sitting in the living room watching television one evening when suddenly they were all startled. The entire room began to glow, this red aura. The entire room shifted from normal over to red. They all started to hear this strange humming noise, and so they ran out the front door. They see a giant UFO, this flying object that's glowing this red color and also different hues of yellow and green, but predominantly this red color. And this thing is about 4 times the size of even their house. They could have sworn that it was either resting on the roof of the house or balanced on top of it in some unnatural way. They even described that when they tried to look directly at the object, it almost hurt their eyes, and so it was difficult to look at. But the thing moved away from the house a few miles away, and then it returned back over the house before changing colors and disappearing. But here we start to see this pattern forming of these objects either initially appearing as a red light, this time the entire room glowing red. There seems to be a red shift, a red laser, or a consistent pattern of some kind of a red laser beam energy scanning through the environment up and around the Uinta Basin before they even called it Skinwalker Ranch. On September 18th, 1966, a group of individuals, youth, were riding their bicycles about 15 miles southeast of Duchesne, and they witnessed something unusual. They saw this bright red ball flying up in the sky. They saw this big bright light just below the ridge around the treetop level, and then it started moving towards them. As it got closer, they could actually see that it had a large dome to it. These encounters with this red ball or red laser seem to continue. Our next witness account is very similar. There ends up being 4 different groups of witnesses that all seem to have seen this same event happen. They all reported different days and times, and so they could have been different, but there is a possibility that they're remembering it in a different manner, and it all happened at the same time. So at almost the same time as the sighting with Kent Denver that looks like the bowling pin, we have this report of these 4 kids that are riding their bicycles, and they actually see this giant fireball floating in the sky that doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and it doesn't seem to be disappearing. But again, they see a double convex shape instead of a bowling pin, so the details are slightly different, even though the time and place, maybe it's the perspective, the point of view. But we also have a third witness account. A man by the name of Verl Haslam and his wife are in their truck with the son asleep in the back, and they get this funny feeling like something's wrong back home and they should head home. Verl recounts that he actually floored the gas pedal in his old truck trying to get home quick when they see this red ball floating above their house. When they were about a quarter of a mile from the house, the object moves quickly to the south. Right as they get up to the house, the object moves slightly and then the light goes out, but they report that it didn't just turn off. It turned again yellow and blue and maybe a tinge of green before the thing disappears. Just when they think it couldn't get any stranger, the light comes back on by reversing the colors in a different order, turning red again, and then they described it as being like a meteor in reverse, going up into space instead of coming down from the sky. When Verl actually told Junior Hicks this story, he claims that he looked up at the object and said, "Look, it's a flying saucer," and that he claimed that there was no doubt in his mind it was some kind of an extraterrestrial machine. You guys, I had so much fun creating the AI art to go along with all of these cool stories out of this book, the Utah UFO Display. Think about what you want. There's a whole bunch more stories if you want me to continue to dig into it, or up into Bob Bigelow's era, Mount Wilson Ranch, and the purchasing of Skinwalker Ranch. Let me know where we should go next. Should we go into the rest of the UFO stories up around the Uinta Basin, and then we'll tie it in to the first initial naming of Skinwalker Ranch and how all of that kicked off? Let me know down in the comments below. Until then, you guys, we'll see you in the next one.